Hi, so we're going to change the public and private IP addresses from dynamic to static, and we are going to confirm that. So let's see how we can do that. So we're back on the Azure portal, and we need to go to our virtual machine. So click on virtual machine, and this is the virtual machine we created. So we can see that the public IP address we have here is 52.152.128.90, and the private IP address that was issued based on the subnet we created is 10.10.0.4. So if we want to see whether the public IP address is dynamic or static, we'll just click on this, and we can see the name we gave to the public IP address, and we can see that we have dynamics selected here. So if we were to change only the public IP address to static, we only need to click on this and save it. But because we want to change both of them at the same time, that is the public and the IP address, there is another way we can do that. So let's go back to our web server, which is the virtual machine, and we want to change this private IP address, which is dynamic, which has been issued from the subnet which we created and is dynamic, to static. At the same time, we also want to change the public IP address, which is dynamic, to static. So let's prove that the public IP address is dynamic. So to do that, we can see the virtual machine is currently running, so we need to shut down the machine temporarily, and we'll start it again so that it will issue another public IP address. So let's do that now. So to stop it, just come up here and we'll click stop. It says, do you want to reserve the public IP address? No, we do not, and so we want to stop it. So say okay. So it's stopping the virtual machine, and we'll give it a moment, and we can refresh here, and now we can see that the virtual machine has been stopped because we can see the status they are locating, and we can also see the public IP address is now the web server 001 pip, which we gave it as the name. Now we can see that it has changed to the name of the IP address, so it's no more available. So let's start the virtual machine again, and let's refresh, and we can see that our IP address has changed to 52.224.179.232, and the same here. So we've successfully been able to confirm that our public IP address is dynamic. So let's go and change the public IP address at the same time the private IP address to static. So let's go down to networking here. Then when we come down here, we're going to go to the network interface card here, because it says attached to network interface here. So click on that, and now we can see the options for the network interface card. So click on IP configurations, and we can see that we have our private IP address, which was issued dynamically, as we can see here, and also we have the public address, which is also dynamic. So what we need to do is to click on this IP config 1, which is the configuration for the network interface card, and it will bring us to this group of options. So we can see that the private IP address is given as 10.10.0.4 and is dynamic. So let's change that to static. We want to make this .6. It's still part of the subnet range. The public IP address, which is what we have here, is associated already with that virtual machine. So click on create new, and we'll call this server 001 static pip as public IP address. and SQ is basic. Assignment will make it static, and we'll say OK. And now we need to ensure that it's selected here. So web server is the one we'll select, and we make sure it's selected here. So we have changed the private IP to static, and we've also created a static public IP address. So we'll say save. So we'll give it some time. So we can see that it successfully saved the IP address changes, and we can see that it's been associated, and the static private IP has also been created. So we'll go back to our virtual machine, and we'll click virtual machines, and this is our virtual machine. And now we can see that we have a public IP address, which is the 52.255.139.215. So we're going to see that we save this IP address to see that it hasn't changed. So we'll just keep it here, and we're going to stop this. We can also see the private IP address, which is static. So we'll stop the virtual machine again, and we can see that the virtual machine has successfully been stopped. So let's start it again. Refresh, and we can now see it running, and successfully the virtual machine has been started. And we can notice that the IP address which we had before is still the same IP address, and the private IP address is still the same. So that is how to change from dynamic IP addresses to static IP addresses.